The moment Jessica Wong turned to her friend Madison at the office coffee machine and said, "Honestly, David deserves so much better than that boring housewife of his," she had no idea that in exactly 48 hours, HR would be calling her into a conference room to inform her that the boring housewife she was mocking had just become the majority owner of Thompson Associates. What Jessica also didn't know was that I, Sarah Martinez, was standing right behind the break room partition, having arrived early to surprise my husband David with his favorite pastries from the bakery down the street. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I froze as Jessica continued her character assassination, stirring her overpriced oat milk latte with theatrical flourish. I mean, have you seen her at company events? She just stands there in those dowdy cardigans, nodding along while David explains his work like she could never understand it herself. The man is brilliant, he's going places, and she's just deadweight holding him back. Madison, a junior account executive with aspirations bigger than her talent, giggled in agreement. Remember at the holiday party when she tried to contribute to our conversation about the Henderson campaign? It was so awkward, like, sweetie, stick to discussing grocery lists and PTA meetings. Exactly, Jessica said, her voice dripping with condescension. David works 60-hour weeks climbing the corporate ladder while she sits at home doing whatever it is housewives do all day. Shopping, probably, getting her nails done. Living off his success. Little did these two know that while they were gossiping over their $15 coffee drinks, I had just finished a video conference with 3 separate investment banks, finalizing the paperwork that would make me their boss before the week was out. But standing there, clutching a box of David's favorite maple bars, listening to my character being demolished by a 26-year-old who still asked her mother to do her taxes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not anger, exactly. More like the cold, calculated satisfaction of someone who knows they're about to win a game their opponents don't even realize they're playing. The foundation of my current situation was built 5 years ago, though nobody at Thompson Associates knew the real story. According to the narrative David liked to tell at company barbecues and networking events, his devoted wife Sarah had stepped back from her little marketing job to focus on supporting his career advancement. The reality was far more complex and infinitely more lucrative. My little marketing job had actually been Martinez Digital Solutions, a boutique consultancy I'd built from nothing into Portland's most sought-after brand strategy firm. While David was grinding away at Thompson Associates, slowly climbing from account coordinator to senior account manager, I was quietly revolutionizing how Pacific Northwest companies approach their digital presence. My client roster read like a who's who of regional success stories, from craft breweries that became national brands to tech startups that caught the attention of Silicon Valley investors. The decision to sell Martinez Digital Solutions hadn't been driven by any desire to become a traditional housewife, despite what David's colleagues assumed. It had been pure business strategy. After 8 years of building something from scratch, I recognized the signs of market saturation in the boutique consultancy space. Larger agencies were acquiring smaller firms, and the choice was either scale up significantly or cash out at the peak. I chose the latter, selling to a Seattle-based agency for $8 million. $8 million that David knew nothing about. The acquisition had been structured carefully, with payments spread over 3 years and strict confidentiality agreements that meant even David, as my spouse, wasn't entitled to information about the deal unless I chose to share it. I hadn't chosen to share it. Instead, I'd let him believe his version of events, while I quietly funneled that money into what would become my real masterpiece. SM Capital wasn't listed in any Portland business directories. It didn't have a flashy website or a downtown office with my name on the door. What it had was something far more valuable in the world of private equity: invisibility and results. Operating out of my converted garage office, behind a false wall that David assumed held seasonal decorations, I'd spent 3 years building what was essentially a one-woman acquisition fund, focused on undervalued mid-size companies in the Pacific Northwest. My strategy was simple but effective. Identify profitable companies hampered by poor management, outdated systems, or family succession problems. Acquire them quietly, usually through shell companies or partnerships with other investors. Implement operational improvements that any competent business school graduate could execute. Then either sell them for substantial profits or hold them as part of a growing portfolio of cash-generating assets. The $8 million from Martinez Digital Solutions had become $12 million. The $12 million was about to become the controlling interest in Thompson Associates, the company where my husband worked and where Jessica Wong apparently felt qualified to judge my life choices. Thompson Associates was exactly the kind of opportunity I specialized in finding. Founded 22 years ago by Michael Thompson, it had grown from a two-person operation into a respectable mid-size agency with annual revenues hovering around $30 million. The problem was that Michael Thompson, now 58, had become comfortable. Too comfortable. The company's client roster was stable but aging, their service offerings hadn't evolved with digital trends, and their operational efficiency was hampered by layers of middle management that existed more for ego than productivity. More importantly, Michael was facing the classic founder's dilemma. His children had no interest in the business, his key employees couldn't afford to buy him out, and he wasn't quite ready to retire but was tired of the daily grind. It was the perfect storm for someone with my resources and expertise. The preliminary negotiations had taken 6 months of careful maneuvering. Michael knew me only as Sarah Martinez, the wife of one of his directors, who had reached out through intermediaries expressing interest in discussing potential investment opportunities. He had no idea that Sarah Martinez and SM Capital were the same entity, or that I'd spent years analyzing his company's financials, client relationships, and operational weaknesses. During those 6 months, I'd attended every company function, smiled politely while Jessica Wong and her ilk dismissed me as arm candy, and gathered intelligence that no external consultant could have accessed. I knew which clients were unhappy with their service levels. I knew which employees were underpaid and underutilized. I knew exactly how much money the company was leaving on the table through inefficient processes and missed opportunities. I also knew that David had no idea how undervalued he was at Thompson Associates. Despite his dedication and genuine talent, he was earning significantly less than market rates for someone with his experience and client relationship.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
This wasn't unusual in family-founded companies where the owner's personal attachment to his people often translated into paternalistic compensation structures that prioritized loyalty over competitive pay. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica Wong, who earned $38,000 a year as an executive assistant and spent her evenings scrolling through Instagram influencer accounts dreaming of a lifestyle she couldn't afford, felt qualified to judge my choices. Or that Madison, who lived in a studio apartment with 2 roommates and drove a car held together by hope and credit card debt, considered me pitiable for my supposedly dependent lifestyle. What they saw when they looked at me was a cautionary tale, a woman who had given up her independence to play supporting role in her husband's story. What they couldn't see was the carefully orchestrated performance that allowed me to operate in plain sight. The boring cardigans they mocked were custom-made pieces that cost more than Jessica's monthly rent. The awkward questions I asked about company operations were strategic intelligence gathering. The dependent housewife routine was the perfect cover for someone building a business empire one acquisition at a time. The morning after the coffee machine incident, I sat in my hidden office reviewing the final paperwork for the Thompson Associates acquisition. The converted garage space bore no resemblance to the rest of our suburban home. Behind the false wall that concealed it from David's view, I'd created a fully functional corporate headquarters complete with multiple monitors, professional lighting for video conferences, and a secure document storage system that would make most law firms envious. My lawyer Amanda Foster appeared on the main screen for our daily check-in call. Amanda was one of the few people who knew the full scope of my operations, having guided me through every acquisition over the past 3 years. She was also someone who understood the unique challenges of being a successful woman in a world that often preferred their success stories to come with more traditional packaging. Final signatures are scheduled for tomorrow morning, Amanda reported, her voice crisp with professional satisfaction. Michael Thompson will retain a 15% stake and continue as CEO for the transition period, but you'll have controlling interest and board majority. The employee announcements are set for Friday morning. I nodded, already anticipating the chaos that Friday would bring to the Thompson Associates office. What about the HR briefings? Rachel Kim has been fully briefed on the ownership change and employee protection protocols. She's prepared to handle the initial shock and answer basic questions about job security and operational changes. The individual department meetings are scheduled throughout the day. The beauty of acquiring Thompson Associates wasn't just the financial return, though the numbers were compelling enough. It was the opportunity to fix everything I'd observed during 3 years of playing the role of dutiful corporate wife. The company had good bones but poor execution, talented people trapped in inefficient systems, and untapped potential that stemmed from leadership that had stopped taking risks a decade ago. Under my ownership, David would finally be compensated at market rates for his expertise. Jessica Wong would have the opportunity to prove whether her confidence was backed by actual competence, now that her job security would depend on performance rather than her ability to manage up. And I would have the satisfaction of transforming a stagnant company into something dynamic while watching the people who had underestimated me grapple with the reality of my actual capabilities. The plan for Friday was elegantly simple. Michael Thompson would make the announcement during the monthly all-hands meeting, introducing the company's new majority owner as someone committed to growth, innovation, and recognizing talent wherever it existed within the organization. The employee handbook updates would be distributed explaining the new ownership structure, updated benefits packages, and performance review criteria. And then in the afternoon, I would make my first official appearance as the owner of Thompson Associates, walking into the building where I'd been dismissed as irrelevant for the past 3 years, ready to begin the most satisfying phase of my career. But first I had one more day of being underestimated to endure. One more day of listening to Jessica Wong's opinions about my life choices. One more day of watching David's colleagues treat him with casual disrespect while assuming his wife was too simple to notice or care. 24 hours. That's all that stood between the current version of Sarah Martinez, the woman who was pitied and dismissed, and the version who would walk into Thompson Associates as the person who signed everyone's paychecks. I closed my laptop and prepared to return to my performance as the suburban housewife whose biggest concern was whether to serve salmon or chicken at our next dinner party. It was a role I'd played flawlessly for 3 years, and I could manage it for one more day. After all, the best revenge isn't just success. It's success that forces the people who underestimated you to confront their own assumptions about power, capability, and what it really means to be in control of your own story. Tomorrow, Jessica Wong and everyone else at Thompson Associates would learn that the boring housewife they'd been dismissing had been playing a completely different game all along. And she'd already won. Thursday evening arrived with the familiar rhythm of domestic theater that had defined my life for the past 3 years. David returned home at 7:30, loosening his tie as he walked through the front door, already launching into his daily recap of office politics and client demands. I stood at the kitchen island, preparing his favorite dinner of herb-crusted salmon and roasted vegetables, nodding at appropriate intervals, while mentally reviewing the acquisition documents that would transform everything by tomorrow afternoon. "You won't believe what happened with the Cascade Brewing account today," David said, settling onto his usual bar stool. "Jessica completely saved our presentation when the client started asking technical questions about their digital analytics. I swear that woman is worth her weight in gold. Michael should promote her to account coordinator soon." I kept my expression neutral while internally calculating that Jessica's supposed indispensability would be tested quite differently under new ownership. Her ability to charm clients during presentations was certainly valuable, but her tendency to undermine colleagues and create hierarchical tensions would be addressed through updated performance metrics that prioritized collaborative success over individual grandstanding. "She seems very dedicated to her work," I replied, the understatement of the year delivered with the same mild tone I used when discussing neighborhood grocery store sales. David launched into a detailed analysis of Jessica's strategic thinking, apparently unaware that his wife had spent the afternoon finalizing due diligence reports that revealed exactly how much revenue Thompson Associates was losing through inefficient client retention strategies. While he praised Jessica's presentation skills, I had been reviewing data showing that client satisfaction scores had declined 12% over the past 18 months, primarily due to communication gaps between account management and creative execution. The disconnect between David's perception of workplace dynamics and the actual operational realities would have been amusing if it weren't so indicative of the broader management problems at Thompson Associates. Good employees like David were working harder to compensate for systemic inefficiencies, while personalities like Jessica thrived in an environment that rewarded visible hustle over measurable results. "How was your day, honey?" David asked, the question clearly perfunctory as he scrolled through emails on his phone. "Quiet," I said, which was technically accurate if you didn't count the 3-hour conference call with potential co-investors, the review of updated employee contracts, or the strategic planning session with Amanda Foster about post-acquisition integration timelines. "I finished that book you gave me for my birthday." This was our established pattern. David would share workplace drama that he assumed I couldn't fully comprehend. I would provide supportive but limited responses. And we would maintain the comfortable fiction that his professional life was the complex, important sphere while mine consisted of domestic maintenance and leisure reading. What David didn't know was that I had been studying Thompson Associates with the intensity of a doctoral dissertation for the past 3 years. Every company barbecue, every holiday party, every casual dinner with his colleagues had been an opportunity to gather intelligence about operational weaknesses, employee satisfaction, and growth opportunities. While he saw these events as social obligations, I treated them as extended interviews with future employees. The irony was that David's genuine talents were being underutilized at Thompson Associates, not because he lacked capability but because the company's structure didn't reward strategic thinking at his level. He was executing campaigns brilliantly within constraints that prevented him from implementing the kind of integrated approaches that would genuinely serve clients' long-term interests. Under new ownership, he would finally have the resources and authority to develop the comprehensive strategies he was capable of creating. Michael mentioned something interesting today, David continued, finally putting his phone aside. Apparently there's been some investor interest in the company, nothing concrete, but he's been having meetings with financial people about potential partnerships or expansions. I kept my face carefully composed while internally marveling at how information traveled through office gossip networks. Michael Thompson had been more discreet than most sellers during our negotiations, but apparently some details were filtering down through the management chain. That sounds like it could be good for everyone. I said a comment that would prove more accurate than David could possibly imagine. I hope so. The company's been pretty stagnant lately, and honestly some fresh perspectives might help. Jessica was saying she thinks we need better technology systems and more competitive benefits packages to retain talent. Jessica's opinions about company needs were about to become significantly less relevant to decision-making processes, but I simply nodded and asked if he wanted dessert with dinner. After David settled into his home office to finish reviewing client proposals, I retreated to my own workspace behind the garage's false wall. The contrast between our evening routines perfectly encapsulated the gap between perception and reality in our marriage. While David spent 2 hours refining presentation slides for a mid-level client pitch, I was conducting final reviews of financial projections that would affect every employee at his company. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda Foster confirming that all legal documentation had been filed and approved. The acquisition would be officially recorded at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, with Michael Thompson making the announcement to staff at 11 a.m. during the monthly all-hands meeting. The timing was perfect. David would learn about the ownership change along with everyone else, in a context that would make it impossible for him to react emotionally or question my methods in front of colleagues. By the time he processed what had happened, I would already be established as the new owner, focused on business operations rather than personal dynamics. I had considered telling him privately before the announcement, but 3 years of careful observation had convinced me that David's initial reaction would be complicated by feelings of wounded pride and confusion about why I hadn't shared my plans earlier. Better to let him process the information in a professional setting where social expectations would moderate his response. The secondary benefit was that Jessica Wong and her circle of office gossips would witness David's genuine surprise, making it clear that he hadn't been involved in the acquisition planning. This would protect him from any resentment about perceived inside information while establishing my independence as a business owner who made strategic decisions without requiring spousal approval. My laptop chimed with an encrypted message from the investment consortium that had partnered with me on the Thompson Associates purchase. The final wire transfer had been completed, officially making me the majority shareholder of the company where I had been treated as decorative irrelevance for the past 3 years. $12 million. That's what it had cost to purchase controlling interest in Thompson Associates, along with the satisfaction of proving that the boring housewife had been the most financially successful person in the building all along. The acquisition represented more than personal vindication, though that element was certainly satisfying. Thompson Associates had genuine potential that was being constrained by conservative management and outdated operational approaches. Under proper leadership, the company could easily double its revenue within 2 years through strategic client development, service expansion, and operational efficiency improvements. I had identified specific opportunities that Michael Thompson's cautious approach had prevented the company from pursuing. 3 major regional clients had expressed interest in comprehensive digital transformation services that Thompson Associates was technically capable of providing but had declined to offer due to concerns about resource allocation and timeline management. Under new ownership, these projects would become the foundation for expanding into higher-value service categories. The employee retention issues that David frequently complained about stemmed from compensation structures that hadn't been updated to reflect market realities. Talented people like David were staying despite being underpaid because they valued the company culture and client relationships, but several key employees had left in recent months for positions offering 20 to 30% salary increases. My first operational priority would be implementing competitive compensation packages that recognized actual performance rather than tenure or political maneuvering. Jessica Wong's future at the company would depend entirely on whether her confidence translated into measurable results when evaluated against objective performance metrics, rather than her ability to manage upward relationships. The thought of tomorrow's revelations filled me with anticipation rather than anxiety. I had been preparing for this moment for 3 years, building not just the financial resources to acquire Thompson Associates, but the strategic knowledge necessary to improve it immediately upon taking ownership. Friday morning would bring chaos, confusion, and probably some wounded egos as people adjusted to new realities about power dynamics and decision-making authority. But it would also bring the beginning of a transformation that would make Thompson Associates a better company for everyone except those who had been coasting on charm rather than competence. I powered down my computers and secured the documents in my fireproof safe, then returned to the main house where David was finishing his client proposal review. He looked up as I entered his office, his expression softening with the affection that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him in college. "All done for the night," he said, closing his laptop. "This Cascade Brewing campaign is going to be fantastic if we can execute it properly. Sometimes I think about what we could accomplish with better resources and more strategic freedom." Tomorrow he would discover that those resources and strategic freedom were about to become available, delivered by the wife he assumed knew nothing about business strategy or corporate operations. "I'm sure you'll figure out how to make it work," I said, which was both supportive and prophetic in ways he wouldn't understand until 11 a.m. the following morning. We went through our usual bedtime routine, David reviewing his calendar for Friday's meetings while I mentally reviewed my own schedule, which included becoming the boss of everyone he worked with. He fell asleep easily, unaware that our life was about to change in ways that would challenge every assumption he had made about success, capability, and the distribution of power in our marriage. I lay awake longer, not from anxiety but from the electric anticipation of someone who had been playing a complex game for 3 years and was finally approaching the moment when all the pieces would fall into place. Tomorrow Jessica Wong would learn that the boring housewife she had mocked was about to become the person who decided whether her position at Thompson Associates continued to exist. Tomorrow David would discover that his career trajectory was about to improve dramatically, courtesy of the wife he assumed was financially dependent on his success. Tomorrow the performance I had maintained for 3 years would end, replaced by the reality of being Sarah Martinez, majority owner of Thompson Associates, architect of the most personally satisfying business acquisition in Portland's recent corporate history. The alarm clock glowed 3:17 a.m. as I finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of conference rooms and balance sheets and the look on Jessica Wong's face when she realized that everything she thought she knew about power and success was about to be permanently rearranged. Friday morning arrived with the deceptive normalcy of any other workday in the Martinez household. David's alarm chimed at 6:30, followed by the familiar sounds of shower running, coffee brewing, and the morning news providing background noise to our established routine. I maintained my usual schedule of preparing his breakfast and packing his lunch, playing the role of supportive wife one final time before everything changed forever. "Big day today," David said, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. Michael called that all-hands meeting for 11, which usually means either really good news or really bad news. "The rumor mill is working overtime trying to figure out what's happening." I handed him his travel mug of coffee, the same blend I'd been making for 8 years, and smiled with what I hoped looked like wifely concern rather than barely contained anticipation. "I'm sure whatever it is you'll handle it well." David kissed my cheek and headed out to his Honda Civic, the reliable but unremarkable car that would soon be replaced by something more befitting his new compensation package. I watched from the kitchen window as he backed out of our driveway, completely unaware that his wife had been awake since 4 a.m. reviewing acquisition documents and finalizing the speech she would deliver to Thompson Associates employees later that afternoon. The morning hours passed with excruciating slowness.
I attempted to maintain normal activities, responding to neighborhood social media posts about an upcoming block party and organizing David's closet, but my attention kept drifting to my hidden office where the final pieces of corporate transformation were falling into place. At 9:15, my secure phone rang with the call I'd been anticipating. Michael Thompson's voice carried a mixture of relief and nervous excitement as he confirmed that all legal requirements had been satisfied and the ownership transfer was officially complete. "Sarah, I have to admit, when you first approached me about this opportunity, I never imagined it would work out so perfectly," Michael said. "Having someone who already understands our culture and client relationships take over makes this transition feel much more comfortable than selling to some faceless corporate entity." The irony wasn't lost on me that Michael felt comfortable precisely because he still saw me as David's harmless wife, rather than the calculating business strategist who had identified his company's weaknesses and constructed a takeover plan that maximized my advantages while minimizing his ability to negotiate better terms. "I'm looking forward to working together during the transition period," I replied, professional warmth masking the predatory satisfaction of someone who had successfully executed a complex acquisition while maintaining perfect cover. "The staff announcement is scheduled for 11, and I've prepared remarks that introduce you as
Someone with extensive marketing experience who's committed to growth and employee development. Rachel Kim has briefed all department heads about the ownership change and prepared FAQ documents for the inevitable questions about job security and operational changes. In the afternoon meetings, scheduled throughout the day starting with senior management at 2 p.m., then individual departments every hour after that. Your assistant coordinator meetings are set for next week, once everyone has had time to process the initial announcement. After ending the call with Michael, I spent 30 minutes in meditation, centering myself for the performance of a lifetime. Today would require balancing multiple persona, the surprised wife learning about her husband's workplace changes, the confident new owner establishing authority, and the strategic leader focused on operational improvements rather than personal vindication. The challenge wasn't managing the business aspects of the acquisition, which I had been preparing for extensively. The challenge was navigating the personal dynamics with David, whose pride and confusion would be complicated by 3 years of assumptions about our respective roles and capabilities. At 10:45, I drove to Thompson Associates, parking in the visitor section of the downtown parking garage where I'd attended countless company events as David's plus one. The 15-story glass building looked exactly the same as always, but walking through the lobby as the new majority owner, rather than a trailing spouse, created an entirely different psychological experience. The elevator ride to the 10th floor felt longer than usual, my reflection in the polished steel doors showing the same understated professional attire I'd worn to every Thompson Associates function for 3 years. Today, however, the navy blazer and simple pearl earrings weren't costume pieces designed to help me blend into the background. They were the uniform of someone about to reveal that she'd been the most powerful person in the building all along. The reception area buzzed with nervous energy as employees gathered for Michael's announcement. I spotted David near the coffee station, deep in conversation with Kevin Brooks and 2 other account managers. Jessica Wong stood with her usual cluster of administrative staff and junior employees, gesticulating animatedly as she shared her theories about the mysterious all-hands meeting. "I heard it's definitely about the investor rumors," Jessica was saying, her voice carrying across the open workspace with characteristic authority. "Michael's probably announcing some kind of partnership deal that will finally give us the resources to compete with the bigger agencies." Madison nodded eagerly, hanging on Jessica's every word. "Do you think there will be promotions, new positions opening up?" "Definitely," Jessica replied with complete confidence. "Companies don't call emergency meetings to announce bad news. This is probably going to be the best thing that's happened to Thompson Associates in years." I almost felt sorry for her. Jessica's confidence in her own indispensability was about to collide with the reality of objective performance metrics and accountability structures that prioritized results over politics. Michael Thompson emerged from his corner office at 11 sharp, his usually composed demeanor showing traces of the nervousness that accompanies major life transitions. At 58, he had built Thompson Associates from a 2-person startup into a regional success story, but the prospect of stepping back from daily operations clearly triggered mixed emotions about legacy and relevance. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice," Michael began, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. "I know there's been speculation about today's announcement, and I appreciate your patience while we finalized some important details." The room fell silent except for the barely audible hum of computer servers and air conditioning systems. I positioned myself near the back wall, close enough to observe reactions but far enough away to avoid immediate attention. After 22 years of building this company, I've made the decision to step back from daily operations and welcome new ownership that will take Thompson Associates to the next level of growth and success. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as employees processed the implications of ownership change. David's expression showed surprise but not alarm, reflecting his general confidence that competent leadership would recognize his value regardless of corporate structure. Our new majority owner brings extensive marketing experience and a commitment to operational excellence that will benefit everyone in this room. She's already demonstrated her understanding of our culture and client relationships, and I'm confident that Thompson Associates will thrive under her leadership. The pronoun landed with particular impact, causing several conversations to start and stop abruptly as people realized the new owner was a woman. In an industry still dominated by male leadership, this detail added an extra layer of intrigue to the announcement. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Martinez, who will be taking over as majority owner and working closely with our management team to ensure a smooth transition. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then David's head snapped around as he scanned the room, looking for his wife who couldn't possibly be the Sarah Martinez that Michael was talking about. His eyes found mine across the crowded space, and I watched his expression transition through confusion, disbelief, and finally stunned recognition. Jessica Wong's reaction was equally dramatic but less controlled. Her mouth literally fell open as she stared at me, the boring housewife she had been mocking 24 hours earlier, trying to process how the woman in dowdy cardigans had somehow become her boss. I stepped forward, allowing Michael to guide me to the front of the room where the entire Thompson Associates staff could see me clearly. The same faces that had smiled politely at company parties while dismissing me as irrelevant were now focused with the intense attention reserved for people who controlled paychecks and career advancement. "Thank you, Michael," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority I'd developed through 3 years of managing complex business negotiations. "I'm excited about the opportunities ahead for Thompson Associates, and look forward to working with each of you to build on the strong foundation that's already been established." I paused, letting my gaze move deliberately across the assembled employees, making eye contact with key individuals including David, whose expression had settled into shocked attention, and Jessica, who looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Over the next few weeks, we'll be implementing some operational improvements designed to enhance both our client services and our employee experience. Department meetings are scheduled throughout the afternoon to discuss specific changes and answer your questions about how this transition will affect your roles and responsibilities. The questions started immediately, a mixture of professional concerns about job security and personal curiosity about how David's wife had somehow acquired their company. Michael Thompson fielded most of the initial inquiries, explaining the transition timeline and his continuing role as CEO during the integration period. But I could see the real conversations happening in the spaces between official Kunda. Colleagues were glancing between David and me, trying to understand the dynamics of a marriage where one spouse had secretly orchestrated the acquisition of the other's workplace. Jessica Wong was whispering urgently to Madison, probably trying to reconcile her dismissive comments from yesterday with the reality of my new authority. Individual department meetings will begin at 2 p.m., Michael concluded. HR has prepared documentation about the ownership change and updated employee policies that will be distributed this afternoon. In the meantime, please feel free to approach either Sarah or myself with any immediate concerns. As the crowd began to disperse, David approached me with the careful expression of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. His colleagues watched this interaction with obvious curiosity, wondering how a husband discovers that his wife has purchased his company. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." I nodded, understanding that this conversation would determine whether our marriage survived the revelation that everything he thought he knew about our relationship had been carefully constructed performance art. "My office or yours?" I asked, the question carrying implications that neither of us had fully processed yet. David's expression showed that he was beginning to understand the scope of changes that Friday morning had brought to both our professional and personal lives. The woman he had married in college, the wife he assumed was financially dependent on his career success, had just revealed herself to be the most powerful person in his professional world. The next few hours would test whether 8 years of marriage could withstand the discovery that one spouse had been hiding a parallel life of extraordinary business success, or whether the foundation of their relationship had been too damaged by assumptions and deceptions to survive the truth. David and I found ourselves in Michael Thompson's conference room, the same space where I had attended countless spouse-included company celebrations, always seated in the corner, while the real employees discussed business strategies I supposedly couldn't understand. Now as the majority owner, I occupied the head of the table while my husband sat 3 chairs away, processing revelations that challenged 8 years of assumptions about our marriage. "I don't understand," David said finally, his voice carefully controlled in the way that indicated he was fighting to maintain professional composure in a professional setting. "When did this happen? How did this happen? And why didn't you tell me?" The questions were inevitable, but hearing them from my husband in the conference room of the company I now owned created a surreal overlay of personal and professional crisis that I had been anticipating for months. David's confusion was genuine and understandable. From his perspective, his housewife had somehow transformed overnight into a corporate owner with resources he hadn't known existed. "The acquisition process took 6 months," I said, choosing my words carefully. "The opportunity arose through some business connections from my previous work, and I decided to pursue it as an investment opportunity that made financial sense." This was technically accurate while omitting the 3 years of strategic planning, intelligence gathering, and wealth accumulation that had made the purchase possible. David didn't need those details immediately, but he would eventually require a more comprehensive explanation about the parallel life I had been living. "Previous work," David repeated, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to question other assumptions about my background and capabilities. "You mean your marketing job from 5 years ago? Martinez Digital Solutions was more successful than I discussed at the time," I replied, which was a masterpiece of understatement considering the $8 million sale that had funded my acquisition activities. "When I sold the company, I invested the proceeds rather than spending them, and those investments generated the capital for this purchase." David stared at me with the expression of someone discovering that their spouse had been leading a double life, which was essentially accurate despite my careful avoidance of anything illegal or unethical. The woman he thought he knew had been real, but incomplete, hiding the most significant aspects of her identity and activities behind a performance of domestic contentment. "So you've been running some kind of investment business from our house, while I thought you were taking time off from your career to support mine," David said, processing the implications of systematic deception. "For 3 years you've been building towards buying my company while listening to me complain about management decisions and office politics." The hurt in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt the first genuine pangs of guilt about the methods I had used to achieve my objectives. David's pain was collateral damage from a strategy that had prioritized business success over marital transparency, but that didn't make his feelings less valid or my choices less consequential. "I wasn't planning to buy Thompson Associates specifically," I said, which was partially true. "I was looking for acquisition opportunities in the Portland market, and this company fit the criteria for undervalued businesses with growth potential." "But you knew it was my company," David countered. "You attended every office party and company event for 3 years, gathering information while everyone, including me, assumed you were just being a supportive spouse." This was the core of David's emotional response, and I understood why discovering the calculated nature of my participation in his professional life felt like betrayal. He had shared his workplace frustrations and career aspirations with someone he thought was offering emotional support, not realizing that his wife was conducting market research for a potential acquisition. "I was being supportive," I said carefully. "Everything I've observed about Thompson and Associates confirms that you're undervalued here, both in terms of compensation and responsibility. Under new ownership, your career opportunities will improve significantly." David's laugh held no humor. "So you bought my company to give me a promotion? Without consulting me, or even telling me what you were planning?" The question highlighted the fundamental tension between business logic and personal relationships that had complicated my decision-making throughout the acquisition process. From a strategic perspective, keeping David uninformed had been necessary to maintain operational security and avoid potential conflicts of interest. From a marital perspective, the deception represented a massive breach of trust and communication. "I bought Thompson and Associates because it was a sound business opportunity," I said, choosing honesty over diplomacy. "The fact that it will benefit your career was a positive factor, but not the primary motivation." This answer clearly wasn't what David had hoped to hear, but it had the advantage of being truthful. My attraction to Thompson and Associates had begun with financial analysis and strategic assessment, not spousal loyalty. The personal satisfaction of proving my worth to people who had dismissed me was significant, but secondary to the business case for acquisition.
Michael Thompson knocked on the conference room door, interrupting our conversation with a reminder that the afternoon department meetings were scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. David and I would need to postpone our personal discussions until evening, when we could address the marital implications of corporate ownership without an audience of curious employees. "We'll continue this conversation at home," David said, standing with the careful dignity of someone whose professional and personal worlds had collided in unexpected ways. "Right now, I need to process what this means for my job and my colleagues." I nodded, understanding that David required time to separate his roles as my husband and my employee, a psychological adjustment that would be complicated by his wounded pride and confusion about my methods. The next several hours unfolded with the controlled chaos typical of major corporate transitions. I conducted meetings with each department, explaining the operational changes that would improve efficiency, while addressing concerns about job security and cultural shifts. Most employees responded positively to discussions about updated compensation structures and performance metrics, though I could sense underlying anxiety about working for someone they had previously dismissed as irrelevant. Jessica Wong's department meeting was particularly enlightening. As Thompson Associates senior administrative staff, she had positioned herself as indispensable to daily operations, managing executive calendars and client communications with theatrical efficiency that impressed visitors, but created unnecessary bottlenecks in actual workflow. "I'm sure you understand that any ownership transition requires careful evaluation of all positions and responsibilities," I said, watching Jessica's confident expression shift toward concern as she realized her job security might depend on objective performance rather than personal charm. "Of course," Jessica replied, her voice maintaining professional composure while her eyes showed the calculation of someone reassessing their position. "I've been documenting all my current responsibilities and client relationships to ensure a smooth transition under new management." This was exactly the kind of defensive maneuvering that confirmed my assessment of Jessica's approach to workplace dynamics. Rather than focusing on how her skills could contribute to improved operations, she was already positioning herself as too valuable to replace, a strategy that worked with insecure managers, but would be less effective with someone who valued results over politics. "I'll be reviewing all administrative functions over the next few weeks," I said neutrally. "We'll discuss opportunities for role expansion or modification based on company needs and individual capabilities." Jessica nodded with the forced enthusiasm of someone who suddenly realized that yesterday's casual dismissal of the new owner might have career consequences. Her transformation from condescending confidence to careful deference would have been satisfying if it weren't so predictable. The administrative staff meeting concluded with Jessica volunteering to prepare detailed reports about departmental efficiency and client satisfaction metrics, obviously hoping to demonstrate her value through data rather than relationships. This represented exactly the kind of accountability-focused approach I intended to implement across all departments. By 6 p.m., I had completed meetings with every department and established the framework for operational improvements that would begin the following week. Employee reactions ranged from cautious optimism to nervous uncertainty, but no one had resigned or created dramatic scenes that would complicate the transition process. David remained at his desk through the afternoon meetings, maintaining professional focus while processing personal revelations that had redefined his understanding of our marriage. I could see him fielding questions from colleagues who were curious about the dynamics of being married to their new boss, conversations that probably ranged from supportive to awkward depending on previous relationships and personalities involved. As employees began leaving for the weekend, I found myself alone in Michael Thompson's office, reviewing the day's documentation and preparing for the comprehensive operational analysis that would guide decision-making over the coming months. The acquisition had been completed successfully, but transforming Thompson Associates into the efficient, profitable company I envisioned would require sustained focus and strategic implementation. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda Foster congratulating me on a successful acquisition announcement and reminding me about the follow-up legal requirements that would formalize various aspects of the ownership transition. The business mechanics of buying Thompson Associates had proceeded exactly as planned, but the personal consequences were just beginning to unfold.
Management decisions when you were planning to become the management. This was the heart of David's sense of betrayal, and I realized that my attempts to explain the business logic behind my methods had missed the more important issue of how those methods had affected our personal relationship. From David's perspective, I had weaponized his trust and intimacy in service of professional objectives he knew nothing about. "You're right," I admitted. recognizing that acknowledgement of wrongdoing was more important than continued justification of my strategic choices. I turned our marriage into a tool for business advantage without your knowledge or consent. Regardless of my intentions or the eventual benefits, that was unfair to you and damaging to our relationship. David looked surprised by my direct acceptance of responsibility, and I realized that he had been prepared for me to continue defending my actions rather than acknowledging their emotional costs. "Thank you for saying that," he said quietly. "I needed to hear that you understand why this feels like betrayal, even if you had good reasons for your choices." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest exchange we had shared in 3 years, as David described the psychological impact of discovering that major decisions affecting both our lives had been made without his input or awareness. His sense of agency and partnership in our marriage had been undermined by my secret activities, leaving him feeling manipulated and diminished regardless of the positive outcomes I had achieved. "I keep thinking about all the times I worried about our financial future," David said, his voice carrying genuine pain rather than anger. "Lying awake wondering if we were saving enough for retirement, or whether we could afford to have children, or if I was advancing fast enough in my career to provide the security we would need. And all that time, you knew those concerns were meaningless because you had resources that made my salary irrelevant." This was perhaps the most damaging aspect of my deception, the way it had allowed David to carry psychological burdens that I could have alleviated simply by sharing information about our actual financial situation. My desire for independence had created artificial stress and insecurity for the person I loved most, a consequence I had minimized in my focus on business objectives. "Those concerns weren't meaningless," I said carefully. "Your career and professional growth matter for reasons beyond just financial security. But you're right that I should have shared information that would have reduced your anxiety about our economic stability." David nodded, but I could see that he was still processing the broader implications of my hidden activities. "What else don't I know?" he asked. "Are there other secrets, other aspects of your life that you've been concealing while I thought we were sharing everything important?" The question forced me to examine the full scope of my deception and consider whether there were additional revelations that would emerge over time to cause further damage to David's trust. "The business activities are the main secret," I said honestly. "But there are probably details and connections that will come up as we move forward that you weren't aware of." This wasn't the complete reassurance David had hoped for, but it was truthful in acknowledging that 3 years of hidden activities had created networks and relationships that he would continue discovering as my public role as Thompson Associates owner required more transparency about my background and capabilities. Sunday brought the first glimpse of how our changed circumstances would affect our social interactions when David's colleague Kevin Brooks called to invite us to a barbecue at his house. The invitation, which would normally have been a simple social engagement, now carried complicated undercurrents about workplace hierarchy and the awkwardness of socializing with someone who had become your boss's wife overnight. "I don't think I'm ready for that yet," David said, after hanging up. "Everyone's going to want to talk about the acquisition and ask questions about our marriage that I'm not prepared to answer publicly." I understood his reluctance to navigate social situations where our personal relationship would be scrutinized through the lens of business ownership and power dynamics. The revelation that I had purchased Thompson Associates would inevitably become the subject of office gossip and speculation about how the acquisition had affected our marriage and David's position within the company. "We can decline social invitations until things settle down," I agreed. "There's no rush to navigate those conversations before we've resolved our own questions about how this changes our relationship." The offer seemed to provide some relief for David, who was clearly struggling with the prospect of managing public curiosity about private matters that he was still processing himself. The boundary between our personal and professional lives had been permanently altered by my acquisition of his workplace, creating ongoing complications that would require careful navigation. Monday morning brought the return to Thompson Associates, where I would begin my first full week as the acknowledged owner, while David adjusted to the reality of being married to his ultimate supervisor. The psychological adjustment would be challenging for both of us, requiring us to separate our roles as spouses from our professional relationship in ways that felt artificial but necessary. I arrived at the office early, using the quiet morning hours to review departmental reports and plan the operational improvements that would justify the acquisition price and demonstrate my competence as a business leader. The financial investment in Thompson Associates was substantial, but the personal investment in proving my capabilities to people who had dismissed me was equally significant. Jessica Wong arrived at her usual time, her demeanor noticeably more deferential than it had been the previous week when she was mocking my intelligence and relevance. The transformation wasn't entirely convincing, suggesting that her new respectful attitude was motivated by job security concerns rather than genuine recognition of her previous misjudgments. "Good morning, Mrs. Martinez," Jessica said, with carefully modulated professionalism. "I've prepared the administrative efficiency reports you requested, along with client satisfaction surveys and departmental productivity metrics. The reports were comprehensive and well organized, representing exactly the kind of accountability-focused approach I wanted to see from all employees." Whether Jessica's newfound diligence would persist once the novelty of new ownership wore off remained to be seen, but her immediate response to changed expectations was encouraging. "Thank you," I replied, accepting the documents with the same neutral professionalism I intended to maintain with all employees regardless of their previous attitudes toward me. "I'll review these this morning and schedule follow-up meetings as needed." David's arrival created a moment of awkwardness as Jessica watched our interaction, clearly uncertain about how to navigate the relationship between her new boss and her colleague's husband. The situation was unprecedented in her experience, requiring her to recalibrate social and professional boundaries in real time. "Good morning," David said to both Jessica and me, his tone carefully neutral in a way that suggested he had spent considerable time preparing for this first day of working under his wife's ownership. "I'll be in my office reviewing the Cascade Brewing campaign materials if anyone needs me." The exchange was polite but stilted, reflecting the ongoing adjustment period we were all experiencing as personal and professional relationships realigned around new power structures and revealed information. Throughout the morning, I observed the subtle changes in office dynamics that had emerged since Friday's announcement. Employees who had previously ignored my presence at company events now made efforts to acknowledge me in hallways and elevators. Conversations that had been casual in my presence became more guarded, as people recognized that the person they had dismissed as irrelevant was now in a position to make decisions about their careers and compensation. The transformation was particularly evident during the weekly marketing team meeting, where David presented his Cascade Brewing campaign proposal to the same colleagues who had witnessed his surprise at discovering his wife's new role. His presentation was polished and professional, but I could sense the additional pressure he felt performing under circumstances where his personal and professional credibility were intertwined in unprecedented ways. "Excellent work," I said when David concluded his presentation, offering the same professional feedback I would provide to any employee while being careful not to show favoritism that might undermine his standing with colleagues. "The integration of digital and traditional marketing elements should serve the client's objectives effectively." David acknowledged the feedback with a nod that managed to convey both appreciation and the awkwardness of receiving professional evaluation from his spouse. The meeting continued with other team members presenting their projects, but I could sense the underlying curiosity about how the marriage dynamic would affect workplace relationships and decision-making processes. By lunchtime, it was clear that the adjustment period would require patience and careful boundary management from everyone involved. The revelation of my hidden business activities had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate shock of the acquisition announcement, touching every aspect of how colleagues, friends, and family members understood our marriage and our individual identities. The most challenging realization was that rebuilding trust with David would require not just explanations and apologies, but fundamental changes in how I approached transparency and shared decision-making in our relationship. The independence I had valued so highly had come at a cost that I was only beginning to fully understand, and the success I had achieved might ultimately prove hollow if it couldn't coexist with the marriage I had taken for granted while pursuing my business objectives. The third week of my ownership brought the confrontation I had been anticipating since that first overheard conversation at the coffee machine. Jessica Wong had maintained her facade of professional deference for exactly 14 days before her true nature reasserted itself in ways that would provide the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the difference between my previous powerless position and my current authority as majority owner. It started with small things that might have gone unnoticed by someone less observant or less motivated to document Jessica's actual performance versus her carefully constructed image. Client emails that were delayed or inadequately followed up on. Administrative tasks that were completed late with elaborate excuses about overwhelming workloads. Most significantly, conversations with junior staff that revealed Jessica's continued belief that the ownership change was temporary and that she could outlast any operational modifications through strategic patience and selective compliance. The breaking point came during a client presentation that David had been developing for 3 weeks. Cascade Brewing represented one of Thompson Associates' most important accounts, and the campaign David had designed integrated traditional marketing approaches with innovative digital strategies that could serve as a model for expanding our service offerings to other clients. The presentation was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, with Michael Thompson, myself, David, and Jessica attending to demonstrate our comprehensive approach to client service. Wednesday evening, David discovered that the presentation materials were incomplete. The digital mock-ups that Jessica had been responsible for coordinating with our graphics team were missing crucial elements. The printed materials contained outdated information, and the client research that should have supported the strategic recommendations was superficial and poorly organized. "I don't understand what happened," David said, his frustration evident as he worked late into the evening attempting to reconstruct materials that should have been finalized days earlier. Jessica assured me everything was on schedule and ready for final review. I had been expecting something like this. Jessica's pattern of managing up while failing to deliver actual results had been evident in her administrative efficiency reports. But documenting poor performance required allowing her enough rope to demonstrate her limitations under objective scrutiny rather than subjective evaluation by supervisors who were charmed by her confident presentations. "What did she say when you asked her about the missing components?" I asked, though I suspected Jessica's response would follow predictable patterns of deflection and excuse-making that she had perfected during her tenure at Thompson Associates. She blamed the graphics team for miscommunication, said the client research was more comprehensive than it appeared, and suggested that we might be setting unrealistic expectations for administrative support staff, David replied, his tone indicating that he was beginning to question Jessica's explanations for the first time. This was exactly the kind of crisis that revealed character and competence under pressure. David's response was to work harder and find solutions. Jessica's response was to avoid responsibility and deflect blame onto other people. The contrast would be instructive for everyone involved, particularly Jessica herself. Thursday morning brought an emergency team meeting to address the presentation crisis. I had deliberately avoided intervening Wednesday evening, allowing the situation to develop naturally so that Jessica's performance failures would be evident to everyone rather than appearing to result from unfair scrutiny or personal animosity. "We have 18 hours to prepare materials that should have been completed last week," I said, addressing the assembled team with the calm authority of someone who had managed far more complex crises during my years building Martinez digital solutions. "This is unacceptable from a client service perspective and needs to be addressed immediately." Jessica's response was predictable but illuminating. Rather than accepting responsibility or focusing on solutions, she launched into an elaborate explanation about competing priorities, inadequate resources, and miscommunication between departments that allegedly made the delays inevitable rather than preventable. "The graphics team has been overwhelmed with multiple projects," Jessica explained, her tone carrying the implied criticism that proper planning should have anticipated these scheduling conflicts. "And the client research requirements were more extensive than originally outlined, which created timeline pressures that weren't adequately addressed during the initial project planning phase." David's expression showed that he was recognizing Jessica's pattern of deflecting responsibility while positioning herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. This was the same dynamic that had allowed her to maintain her reputation for indispensability while consistently failing to deliver the results that justified her confident self-assessment. "The timeline and requirements were established 3 weeks ago," David said quietly, his professional composure masking what I knew was significant frustration with Jessica's performance. "The deliverables and deadlines were clearly documented and confirmed in writing." "Well, yes," Jessica replied, "but you know how these projects evolve and change as they develop. There were additional complexities that emerged during the research phase that required more comprehensive analysis than we originally anticipated. This was the moment I had been waiting for." Jessica's inability to accept responsibility while maintaining her image as a competent professional created the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the difference between accountability-based management and the personality-driven approach that had allowed her to thrive under previous leadership. "Jessica," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who controlled paychecks and career advancement, "I've reviewed the project documentation and timeline. The requirements were clearly established and the deliverables were specifically outlined. What I'm hearing from you is an explanation of why you didn't meet those requirements, not a plan for ensuring this doesn't happen again. The silence that followed was profound. Jessica had never been addressed so directly by someone in a position to take concrete action based on her performance rather than her explanations. Her confident facade wavered as she realized that her usual strategies for managing difficult conversations might not be effective with someone who valued results over relationship management. I understand your concern, Jessica said carefully, and I take full responsibility for any communication gaps that might have contributed to this situation. Moving forward, I'll implement more robust tracking systems to ensure all deliverables are completed according to schedule. This was progress but insufficient. Jessica's offer to take full responsibility while simultaneously describing the failures as communication gaps revealed her continued inability to acknowledge actual performance deficiencies rather than external factors that had allegedly complicated her work. The issue isn't communication gaps, I replied, maintaining professional composure while making clear that Jessica's deflection strategies were not acceptable. The issue is that specific tasks with clear deadlines were not completed as assigned. This isn't a systems problem, it's a performance problem. David watched this exchange with obvious interest, seeing for the first time someone hold Jessica accountable for actual results rather than accepting her elaborate explanations for why circumstances had prevented her from meeting expectations. Other team members were equally attentive, recognizing that workplace dynamics were shifting in ways that would affect everyone's approach to responsibility and performance. You're absolutely right, Jessica said, her tone shifting toward genuine contrition as she recognized that continued deflection would only worsen her position. I should have communicated earlier when I realized the timeline was becoming challenging, and I should have requested additional resources or support rather than allowing the deliverables to be compromised. This was more honest acknowledgement than Jessica had provided in the past, but it still framed her failures as timing and communication issues rather than fundamental competence problems. The pattern would likely repeat unless consequences were clear and immediate. Here's what's going to happen, I said, addressing the entire team while making clear that Jessica's performance had created problems that affected everyone's work and the company's reputation with an important client. We're going to recover from this situation and deliver an excellent presentation to Cascade Brewing. David will lead a task force that includes graphics, research, and administrative support to reconstruct the missing materials and ensure everything is ready by this afternoon. I paused, allowing the team to absorb the immediate action plan before addressing the broader implications of Jessica's performance failure. Jessica, you're going to observe this process and document exactly how a well-coordinated project should be managed from initial planning through final delivery. Consider this a learning opportunity to understand the standards we expect moving forward. The psychological impact was immediate and obvious. Jessica had been removed from a leadership role in recovering from her own failure and assigned to observe other people demonstrating competence she had been unable to provide. The consequences were professional rather than personal, but they clearly communicated that performance standards would be enforced regardless of previous relationships or established reputations. The next 8 hours were a masterclass in crisis management as David coordinated resources and rebuilt presentation materials with the efficiency and attention to detail that had made him valuable to Thompson Associates despite being undercompensated and under-recognized. His leadership during the crisis demonstrated exactly the kind of capabilities that would be rewarded under new ownership structure focused on results rather than politics. By 3 p.m., the Cascade Brewing presentation was not only complete but superior to what had been originally planned. The emergency reconstruction had forced the team to collaborate more intensively and refine their approach in ways that produced a more cohesive and compelling final product. The client meeting itself was a triumph. David's presentation was polished and comprehensive, the supporting materials were professional and persuasive, and Cascade Brewing's leadership responded with enthusiasm for both the campaign concepts and the collaborative approach Thompson Associates had demonstrated in developing them. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we've been looking for, the Cascade Brewing marketing director said, after reviewing the complete proposal. We're prepared to move forward immediately and discuss expanding the scope to include additional product lines and market segments. The success was particularly satisfying because it demonstrated the potential that had been constrained by Thompson Associates' previous management approach.
Under leadership that prioritized accountability and rewarded actual performance, the company's talented employees could accomplish far more than they had been allowed to achieve under systems that enabled mediocrity and excused failure. Jessica's response to the successful presentation was revealing. Rather than acknowledging her role in creating the crisis or expressing appreciation for the team effort that had prevented client disappointment, she positioned herself as having contributed to the positive outcome through her supposed coordination and support activities. "I'm so glad we were able to pull everything together," Jessica said to the team after the client meeting concluded. "It's a good reminder of how well we work under pressure when everyone commits to supporting each other." This attempt to claim partial credit for success she had nearly prevented confirmed my assessment of Jessica's character and her unsuitability for continued employment at Thompson Associates. Her inability to learn from failure or acknowledge other people's contributions to success represented exactly the kind of toxic workplace dynamic that undermined team morale and operational efficiency. Friday morning brought the conversation I had been planning since the coffee machine incident 3 weeks earlier. Jessica arrived at my office for her scheduled performance review with the confident demeanor of someone who expected to discuss career advancement and expanded responsibilities rather than consequences for demonstrated incompetence. "Thank you for meeting with me," Jessica said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who assumed their value to the organization was unquestionable. "I've been thinking about ways to improve our administrative systems and expand my role in client relationship management." The presumption was remarkable. Jessica had nearly caused a major client disappointment through performance failures, but she was prepared to discuss expanded responsibilities rather than acknowledging the need for fundamental improvement in her current duties. "Jessica," I said, referring to the documentation I had been compiling throughout her 3 weeks of performance under new ownership, "we need to discuss some concerns about your work quality and professional approach that have become evident since the ownership transition." Her expression shifted from confidence to wariness as she realized this conversation would not follow the pattern of previous performance reviews where her charm and deflection strategies had been sufficient to maintain positive evaluations. "I'm not sure what you mean," Jessica replied carefully. "I've been working very hard to support the transition and maintain our high standards of client service. The Cascade Brewing presentation crisis is a perfect example of what I'm referring to," I said, maintaining professional composure while addressing behavior that had been tolerated but not acceptable. "Specific deliverables with clear deadlines were not completed as assigned, and your response was to blame external factors rather than taking responsibility for performance failures." Jessica's attempt to interrupt with explanations was countered by my continued focus on documented facts rather than subjective interpretations or personality conflicts. "More broadly," I continued, "your approach to workplace relationships and professional responsibilities doesn't align with the standards we're implementing under new ownership. The casual dismissal of colleagues, the resistance to accountability, and the pattern of managing up while failing to deliver results are not compatible with our operational objectives." The moment of truth had arrived. Jessica realized that the person she had mocked as a boring housewife was about to make decisions that would affect her career and financial security in ways that could not be managed through charm or deflection. "I think there might be some misunderstandings about my performance and contributions," Jessica said, her voice showing the first signs of genuine concern as she recognized that her job security was being evaluated based on objective criteria rather than subjective relationships. "There are no misunderstandings," I replied firmly. "Your employment with Thompson Associates is being terminated effective immediately. HR has prepared your final compensation package and will coordinate the return of company property and transfer of your responsibilities to other team members." The silence that followed was complete. Jessica had never imagined that the woman she had dismissed as irrelevant would possess the authority to end her career at Thompson Associates, much less the documented evidence to justify that decision based on performance rather than personal animosity. "This is unfair," Jessica said finally, her professional composure cracking as she realized the full implications of her changed circumstances. "I've been a valuable employee here for 3 years, and everyone knows how hard I work and how much I contribute to our success. Your contributions have been carefully evaluated," I said, handing her the documentation that detailed her performance failures and provided objective evidence for the termination decision. "This isn't personal, it's business. Thompson Associates requires employees who can meet professional standards and accept accountability for their work." Jessica's exit from Thompson Associates was swift and final. Within 2 hours, her desk had been cleared, her access credentials had been deactivated, and her responsibilities had been redistributed among team members who possessed both the competence and professionalism necessary to handle administrative functions effectively. The impact on office
culture was immediate and positive. Employees who had been walking on eggshells around Jessica's moods and political maneuvering seemed visibly relieved to operate in an environment where performance standards were clear and consistently enforced. The toxic dynamic that had enabled Jessica's behavior while constraining other people's effectiveness was permanently eliminated. David's response to Jessica's termination was complex but ultimately supportive. He had worked closely with her for 3 years and appreciated her occasional contributions to client relationships, but he had also witnessed firsthand how her performance failures created additional work and stress for conscientious colleagues. "I can't say I'm surprised," David admitted during our evening conversation about the day's events. Jessica was good at managing up and creating the impression of being indispensable, but her actual work product was inconsistent and often created more problems than it solved. This was perhaps the most important validation of my decision. David's acknowledgement that Jessica's termination was justified based on performance rather than personal conflict confirmed that my evaluation had been accurate and my methods had been appropriate. The following weeks brought the kind of operational improvements that justified the Thompson Associates acquisition from both financial and personal satisfaction perspectives. Employee morale improved as accountability standards eliminated the frustration of watching incompetent colleagues receive the same recognition as productive team members. Client satisfaction increased as communication gaps and project management failures were addressed through systematic process improvements. Most importantly, David's career began flourishing in ways that had been constrained by the company's previous management approach. His compensation was increased to market rates, his project assignments became more strategic and comprehensive, and his recommendations about operational improvements were implemented rather than dismissed or delayed. The marriage recovery process was slower but equally significant. David's initial anger about my deception gradually evolved into appreciation for the positive changes my acquisition had brought to both our professional and personal lives. The financial security that my business success provided allowed him to take creative risks and pursue challenging projects without worrying about the economic consequences of potential failures. "I understand now why you did what you did," David said one evening as we reviewed plans for the European vacation we could now afford without budgetary concerns. "I don't like the deception, and I wish you had trusted me enough to share what you were planning, but I can see how the results have been positive for everyone except the people who deserved consequences." This was the closest thing to forgiveness I could expect, and it represented genuine progress in rebuilding trust and communication in our marriage. David's acknowledgement that my methods had produced beneficial outcomes didn't excuse the deception, but it provided a foundation for moving forward with greater transparency and shared decision-making. Thompson Associates under my ownership became the regional success story I had envisioned during 3 years of strategic planning. Revenue increased 40% in the first year through expanded service offerings and improved client retention. Employee satisfaction reached record levels as compensation and advancement opportunities were aligned with actual performance rather than political considerations. The personal satisfaction of transforming a company while proving my capabilities to people who had underestimated me was considerable, but it was ultimately secondary to the more important achievement of building a business that created value for employees, clients, and the broader Portland business community. Jessica Wong's departure from Thompson Associates marked the end of one chapter in workplace dynamics and the beginning of another where competence and professionalism were rewarded while toxic behavior and performance failures were addressed directly rather than tolerated indefinitely. 6 months after the acquisition, I received a LinkedIn message from Jessica requesting a reference for a job application at another marketing firm. The message was polite and professional, suggesting that her experience at Thompson Associates had provided some educational value about workplace standards and accountability expectations. I declined to provide the reference, not out of personal animosity but because professional integrity required honest assessment of former employees' capabilities and work habits. Jessica's future employers would need to evaluate her suitability based on their own standards and requirements rather than misleading recommendations from someone who had terminated her employment for cause. The Thompson Associates acquisition had achieved every objective I had established during 3 years of planning and preparation. The financial returns exceeded projections, the operational improvements created lasting value for all stakeholders, and the personal vindication of proving my capabilities to people who had dismissed me provided psychological closure that was worth far more than the monetary investment. Most importantly, the experience had demonstrated that success achieved through deception and secrecy, while professionally satisfying, carried personal costs that required careful consideration and eventual reconciliation. The marriage I had taken for granted while pursuing business objectives had been strengthened by adversity but would require ongoing attention to maintain the trust and communication that made partnership meaningful. David and I had emerged from the crisis with a better understanding of each other's capabilities and motivations, but also with renewed appreciation for the importance of transparency and shared decision-making in building a life together. The woman who had been dismissed as a boring housewife had proven her worth in the most definitive way possible, but the victory was meaningful only if it could coexist with the relationships that made success worth achieving. The story of Sarah Martinez and Thompson Associates had ended exactly as planned, with competence rewarded, mediocrity eliminated, and justice served to everyone who had underestimated the quiet woman in the corner who had been planning their future while they gossiped about her limitations. 3 months after Jessica Wong's termination, Thompson Associates hosted its first annual Employee Appreciation Dinner under new ownership, an event that would crystallize the transformation from a stagnant family business into a dynamic regional powerhouse. The venue was the Pearl District's most prestigious restaurant, a choice that reflected both the company's improved financial position and my commitment to recognizing the employees who had embraced change and elevated their performance standards. The evening began with cocktails on the restaurant's rooftop terrace, Portland's skyline providing a dramatic backdrop as employees who had previously been constrained by mediocre leadership celebrated achievements that would have been impossible under the old management structure. David stood beside me, his confidence radiating the satisfaction of someone whose talents had finally been recognized and properly compensated, wearing a custom suit that replaced the off-the-rack business attire he had been forced to accept when his salary barely covered our mortgage payments. 6 months ago, I never imagined we'd be celebrating revenue growth that exceeded our most optimistic projections. Michael Thompson said, raising his glass to address the assembled team. Under Sarah's leadership, we've not only maintained our existing client relationships but expanded into service areas that have positioned us as the premier marketing firm in the Pacific Northwest. The applause that followed carried genuine enthusiasm rather than the polite obligation that had characterized previous company events. Employees who had been demoralized by watching incompetent colleagues receive the same recognition as productive team members were now operating in an environment where excellence was rewarded and mediocrity was addressed directly. Kevin Brooks approached us during the cocktail reception, his expression showing the gratitude of someone whose career trajectory had been dramatically altered by operational changes that recognized actual contribution rather than political maneuvering. Sarah, I wanted to thank you personally for the opportunity to lead the digital integration initiative, he said, referring to the expanded role he had been offered when his innovative ideas were finally implemented rather than dismissed by supervisors who lacked the vision to understand their potential. Your proposals were excellent, I replied, acknowledging Kevin's capabilities while reinforcing the performance standards that had transformed Thompson Associates from a comfortable but stagnant business into an organization that attracted top talent and challenging projects. The client response has validated everything you recommended about comprehensive digital strategies. This was the kind of conversation that had been impossible under previous management, where employees like Kevin had been underutilized, despite possessing exactly the skills necessary to expand service offerings and increase profitability. The systematic evaluation of talent and strategic deployment of capabilities had unlocked potential that had been constrained by leadership that prioritized familiarity over competence. The junior account executive who had participated in mocking my intelligence during that overheard coffee machine conversation, approached with the careful deference of someone who had learned that workplace hierarchies could change dramatically when actual performance became the primary evaluation criteria. Her role had been restructured to focus on research and analysis rather than client-facing responsibilities, a change that better matched her analytical skills while removing her from situations where her judgment and professionalism had proven inadequate. Mrs. Martinez, I wanted to apologize for some comments I made early in the transition period, Madison said, her discomfort evident as she acknowledged behavior that could have resulted in termination if I had chosen to address it as a disciplinary matter rather than a learning opportunity. I realize now that I made assumptions about people and situations that were completely wrong. The apology was appreciated, but more important was Madison's demonstrated improvement in work quality and professional conduct over the 3 months since Jessica's departure had eliminated the toxic influence that had encouraged gossiping and unprofessional behavior among junior staff members. I appreciate you saying that, I replied, choosing to focus on forward progress rather than past mistakes. Your research work on the Henderson campaign was excellent, and I hope you'll continue developing those analytical skills that add real value to our client services. This approach to employee development had proven more effective than punitive measures in creating lasting behavioral change. People who had been influenced by Jessica's toxic workplace culture responded positively to clear expectations and recognition for meeting professional standards, while those who were fundamentally incompatible with accountability-based management had either improved dramatically or left the company voluntarily. The dinner program included recognition of outstanding achievements during the transition period, with particular emphasis on employees who had embraced expanded responsibilities and delivered exceptional results for clients. David received the Leadership Excellence Award for his management of the Cascade Brewing campaign expansion, which had grown from a single product launch into a comprehensive brand strategy that other clients were requesting to emulate. David's strategic thinking and project coordination have set new standards for integrated marketing approaches. I announced while presenting his award, speaking as his employer rather than his wife but unable to suppress pride in his professional growth. The client satisfaction scores and revenue generation from his campaigns represent exactly the kind of excellence we're building Thompson Associates to achieve consistently. The recognition was particularly meaningful because it was based on objective performance metrics rather than subjective relationships or tenure-based advancement. David's success under new ownership demonstrated that his previous limitations had resulted from systemic constraints rather than personal capabilities. A vindication that benefited both his confidence and our marriage as we continued rebuilding trust and communication. Rachel Kim, the HR director who had managed the transition with exceptional professionalism, received recognition for developing the performance evaluation systems that had transformed workplace culture while maintaining employee morale during significant operational changes. Her ability to implement accountability standards without creating adversarial relationships had been crucial to the smooth transition from family business culture to professional corporate environment. Rachel's work in developing our new performance metrics and career advancement pathways has created opportunities for every employee to achieve their potential, I said, acknowledging her contributions while reinforcing the message that success at Thompson Associates was available to anyone willing to meet professional standards. The employee satisfaction surveys show record-high scores for workplace fairness and recognition of merit. The evening's most poignant moment came when Michael Thompson addressed the transformation he had witnessed in the company he had built from nothing but had been unable to modernize effectively. His remarks reflected both pride in what Thompson Associates had become and relief at having found a successor who could preserve the positive aspects of company culture while eliminating the inefficiencies that had constrained growth. When I founded this company 22 years ago, I hoped it would someday become the kind of organization that attracted the best talent and delivered exceptional results for clients. Michael said, his voice carrying the emotion of someone seeing his life's work fulfilled in ways he had been unable to achieve independently. Under Sarah's leadership, that vision has become reality, and I'm grateful that the Thompson Associates name will continue to represent excellence in our industry. The transition period had been managed with sensitivity to Michael's emotional investment in the company while implementing changes that were necessary for long-term viability and growth. His continued involvement as CEO during the integration had provided continuity for employees and clients, while allowing me to demonstrate competence and vision that justified the acquisition investment. As the evening concluded with employees expressing genuine enthusiasm about future opportunities and company direction, I reflected on the personal journey that had brought me from dismissed housewife to respected business leader. The transformation had required strategic planning, financial resources, and psychological resilience, but the most challenging aspect had been maintaining relationships with people who had underestimated my capabilities while secretly working to prove their assumptions wrong. The drive home with David provided an opportunity to process the evening's significance and discuss how our relationship had evolved through the challenges of the past 6 months. The initial shock and hurt caused by my deception had gradually been replaced by mutual respect and shared excitement about possibilities that neither of us could have imagined when he was struggling under previous management constraints. I keep thinking about how different everything is now compared to 6 months ago, David said as we entered our house, the same space where I had maintained my secret business operations while he assumed I was living a simpler life focused on domestic concerns. Not just the financial security or career opportunities, but the way we understand each other and what we're capable of achieving. This was the foundation for rebuilding our marriage on more honest and equitable terms. David's initial anger about my deception had been replaced by appreciation for the positive changes in both our lives, while my defensive justifications had evolved into genuine remorse for the methods I had used to achieve legitimate business objectives. I'm sorry it took a crisis for me to be completely honest about my capabilities and ambitions, I said, acknowledging the emotional costs of my strategic approach to personal relationships. I thought I was protecting our marriage by keeping my business activities separate, but I realize now that the deception was more damaging than transparency would have been. David's response reflected the emotional maturity that had allowed our relationship to survive revelations that could have permanently destroyed trust and intimacy. I understand why you felt you needed to prove yourself independently, he said. I just wish you had trusted me enough to share what you were planning instead of letting me worry about financial security when you had already solved those problems. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest exchange we had shared since college, addressing not only the immediate issues surrounding my acquisition of Thompson Associates but the broader questions about marriage, career ambitions, and the balance between independence and partnership in building a life together. What I've learned is that success means nothing if it comes at the cost of the relationships that make it worthwhile, I said, articulating conclusions that had emerged through months of reflection about priorities and values. The business achievements were satisfying, but they're only meaningful if they enhance rather than replace the personal connections that provide actual happiness. David nodded, his expression showing that he had reached similar conclusions about the relative importance of career advancement and personal relationships. The promotion and salary increase are great, he said, but what matters most is that we're working together towards shared goals instead of me feeling like I'm carrying financial responsibility alone while you pursue separate interests. This represented the psychological breakthrough necessary for rebuilding our marriage on foundations of mutual respect and shared decision-making rather than the paternalistic assumptions that had characterized our relationship before the acquisition. David's recognition that I possessed capabilities equal to or greater than his own had eliminated the subtle condescension that had influenced his behavior, while my acknowledgement of his emotional needs had reduced the defensive secrecy that had driven my deceptive practices. The following Monday brought news that would validate the strategic vision behind the Thompson Associates acquisition in ways that exceeded even my optimistic projections. Cascade Brewing's parent company had decided to consolidate their marketing services with a single agency capable of handling multiple brands across diverse market segments, and they were offering Thompson Associates a contract worth nearly $2 million annually. This is the kind of opportunity we could never have pursued under the old management structure, David said, reviewing the proposal requirements that would have overwhelmed our previous capabilities but were well within our expanded capacity. The scope includes everything from traditional advertising to social media management to event coordination across 6 different product lines. The contract represented validation of the operational improvements and talent development that had positioned Thompson Associates to compete for major accounts that would have been impossible to handle effectively before the acquisition. Our expanded staff, updated technology systems, and accountability-based management culture had created the infrastructure necessary to deliver comprehensive services that large clients required. More importantly, the success demonstrated that my evaluation of Thompson Associates' potential had been accurate despite the skepticism of people who had assumed that my interest in the company reflected naive enthusiasm rather than sophisticated business analysis. The boring housewife who had been dismissed as irrelevant had identified and executed an acquisition strategy that had transformed a stagnant regional business into a competitive player in the Pacific Northwest marketing industry. The psychological satisfaction of proving my business acumen to people who had questioned my understanding of professional dynamics was considerable. But it was secondary to the more important achievement of creating an organization that provided meaningful career opportunities for talented employees while delivering exceptional value for clients who trusted us with their marketing investments. 6 months after the acquisition, I received an unexpected phone call from Jessica Wong, who had apparently struggled to find employment that matched her previous position at Thompson Associates. Her tone was different from the confident dismissiveness I remembered, suggesting that the job market had provided educational experiences about the importance of actual competence versus perceived indispensability. "Sarah, I wanted to reach out and apologize for my behavior during the ownership transition," Jessica said.
her voice carrying genuine remorse rather than the calculated charm she had used in professional situations. I realize now that I was defensive about changes I didn't understand, and I said things about you that were unfair and inappropriate. The apology was unexpected but appreciated, representing acknowledgement of behavior that had been unprofessional regardless of the circumstances surrounding new ownership and operational changes. Jessica's willingness to contact me directly suggested that her employment difficulties had provided perspective about workplace dynamics and professional standards. I appreciate you calling, I replied, choosing to focus on forward progress rather than past conflicts. I hope your experience at Thompson Associates provided some valuable insights about accountability and performance standards that will benefit your future career. The conversation was brief but significant, representing closure on the interpersonal conflict that had symbolized broader issues about respect, competence, and the consequences of underestimating people based on superficial assumptions. Jessica's struggles to find comparable employment had apparently taught her lessons about professionalism that were more effective than any disciplinary measures I could have implemented. 1 year after the acquisition, Thompson Associates was featured in Portland Business Journal as the fastest-growing marketing firm in the region. Recognition that reflected both financial performance and the company culture that had attracted top talent from competitors who couldn't match our compensation packages and advancement opportunities. The article included interviews with employees who described the transformation from family business culture to professional corporate environment, with particular emphasis on the performance-based evaluation systems that had eliminated the frustration of watching incompetent colleagues receive undeserved recognition. Working at Thompson Associates under Sarah Martinez's leadership has been the most rewarding experience of my career. Kevin Brooks was quoted as saying, "The company culture recognizes actual contribution and provides opportunities for professional growth that are based on merit rather than politics or tenure." David's interview focused on the operational improvements that had allowed talented employees to achieve their potential rather than being constrained by inadequate resources and conservative management decisions. The support for innovative approaches and strategic thinking has transformed what we're able to accomplish for clients, he said. We're finally operating at the level that our expertise and dedication deserve. The media recognition was gratifying, but more important was the foundation we had built for sustained growth and continued success in an increasingly competitive industry. Thompson Associates had evolved from a comfortable, unremarkable regional business into an organization that set standards for excellence while maintaining the positive aspects of company culture that had attracted good employees even under previous management limitations. The personal journey from dismissed housewife to respected business leader had required confronting assumptions about gender, capability, and the distribution of power in both professional and personal relationships. The success had vindicated my strategic approach while teaching important lessons about the costs of deception and the value of transparency in building sustainable achievements. Most importantly, the experience had demonstrated that underestimation by others could be transformed into competitive advantage through careful planning, sustained effort, and the patience to allow results to speak louder than defensive explanations or self-promotional activities. The woman who had been mocked for her dowdy cardigans and boring lifestyle had proven that intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking were more valuable than charm or political maneuvering in building lasting success. The transformation of Thompson Associates from acquisition target to industry leader represented the ultimate validation of capabilities that had been dismissed by people who confused visibility with substance. David and I had emerged from the crisis with a stronger marriage built on mutual respect and shared ambitions rather than traditional role expectations that had constrained both our potentials. The financial security provided by business success had eliminated sources of stress that had complicated our relationship, while the professional recognition had validated capabilities that had been undervalued by previous social and workplace dynamics. The story of Sarah Martinez and Thompson Associates had concluded exactly as envisioned during 3 years of strategic planning and careful execution. Competence had been rewarded, mediocrity had been eliminated, and the quiet woman in the corner had proven that the most dangerous opponents are those who are systematically underestimated by people who mistake confidence for capability. The acquisition had generated financial returns that exceeded projections, but the personal satisfaction of demonstrating my worth to everyone who had dismissed me as irrelevant was the achievement that made all the planning and risk worthwhile. Success achieved through deception carried emotional costs that required ongoing attention, but the alternative of remaining invisible while others claimed credit for inferior work had been unacceptable. Thompson Associates under my ownership had become everything I had envisioned during those secret planning sessions in my hidden office. An organization that combined financial success with workplace culture that attracted talented employees and delivered exceptional value for clients who entrusted us with their marketing investments. The transformation was complete, the vindication was total.